Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started, guys. Good morning. Once again, my name is Amir Sadeghi, and this is the presentation on the new Topa laws. There was a quick question asked about the presentations being available otherwise, and yes, they are going to be available on our website. We also have handouts that are going to be, they're already in your packet. This is what the front looks like. This is what the back looks like. So if you don't have one of them, I'm happy to give you additional ones. But they should be in the bags that you've got. Please raise your hand if you have not received one of those bags. Yes. The red folders, if you open the red folders, you'll have, yes. So in the red folders, you have two things. You have this thing, and then right behind it is this. Yeah. So hopefully you won't need to take notes because everything that I'm going to be describing and explaining today should be covered in this form, but obviously you're welcome to do so if you'd like so anyway. Topa, I'm sure you all already know, but it's the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, and it essentially gives DC tenants the right to purchase the building in which they reside in the case that their landlord decides to sell the building. Now, effective July 3rd of this year, the law was changed with regard to single-family accommodations. Whereas before, Topa applied to all rental units, now single-family accommodations are going to be treated differently. Now, what are the properties that are affected? We have the definition of single-family accommodation. It's in your packet. Not going to go through it again, but essentially you're dealing with a row home, a single-family detached property, a condo, any single-family unit. Or a single-family accommodation with an accessory dwelling unit. So let's say you've got a detached single-family home and you've got an accessory, like a carriage house or something in the back. That also falls under the definition of single-family accommodation. It's a rental unit secondary to principal SFA, but has separate kitchen and bath and maybe entrance. Now, let's do a couple quick examples just so we're on the same page what it means. Landlord owns a condominium in a 24-unit condominium building in DuPont Circle. Please raise your hand if you believe that that falls under the single-family accommodation. No. Oh, no, why not? Tell us why not.
No, I think so, because they're individual condominiums.
Exactly. Exactly. Condominiums are all separately deeded. So if you own a condominium unit, you just own that one single unit. Yeah. Tenants renting an entire row home in Navy Yard. Yes or no? Who thinks that it falls under the category of single-family accommodation? Again, just Corey? All right, go ahead. Why not? You think it doesn't fall into single-family accommodation, Robert? No? It does? It doesn't. It does. It falls under single-family accommodations. All right. Proprietors of George Washington's Mount Vernon renting a single carriage house unit. Does that fall under Topa? Yes? That's a trick question. Mount Vernon is in Virginia. It's in Virginia. It's over across the river. Yeah. No, just having some fun here. Georgetown townhome divided into an upstairs and a basement unit, right? So it's a single townhome unit. You got a unit upstairs, unit downstairs. Does that fall into the category of single-family accommodation? Who thinks yes?
It's condos or it's all three?
Sorry?
Like is it, you're saying a townhome where is it separate?
It's one condo, one townhome that's just, all of it is under one deed. So it's not been subdivided. But it's being rented out as two separate units. Does that fall under the single-family accommodation?
I would think it would.
It does not. It does not. That would be considered a two-unit. Yeah, because so that one's a little bit nuanced, and here's why. If you have, let's say, multiple people living in one home and they're all under the same lease, then you got a single family, a single unit property, right? But let's say you've divided it up now, even though it's all part of one deeded property. You've got one lease for the basement, one lease for one floor, another lease somewhere else. Now it could be considered. No, the owners are not living in it.
So it's just tenant upstairs and.
Exactly. Now, if the owners were living upstairs and they were renting out of the basement, it would fall under the category of SFA. Yes, yes. So, yeah, you know what? For the next presentation, I'll clarify and make sure. Make sure.
That's what I was, okay.
Sure. No, I understand. All right. Now, there are a couple of different notices, and so this is probably going to be the most confusing part of this law, and so this is where I need your attention the most. There are two different types of notices that have to be sent under this new Topa law. Within 3 calendar days of either soliciting or receiving in writing an offer to purchase a single family accommodation, the owner with an intent to sell has to deliver a written notice of the offer to all tenants. All right? Now, notice is good for 1 year, so the landlord does not have to renew the notice unless new tenants move in. And a civil action against the landlord is the only remedy. So you cannot file a lease pendants, you cannot file Topa Title 5 remedy, Title 4 remedies, and other remedies preventing the sale. Now, what is this notice? This is the solicitation notice, all right? So the solicitation notice is essentially a heads up to the tenants. It's an FYI, guys, either I'm putting the place on the market and I intend to sell it, or somebody has approached me and told me they want to purchase the property and I intend to sell it. And I want to let you know because you have the same rights as everybody else to try to come in, put in an offer, and try to compete to purchase the property, right? So that goes to all tenants. Now, there's a second notice, which is the status inquiry notice. That notice is a notice of intent to sell, demolish, or discontinue the use as a rental housing, and the purpose is to determine whether tenants claim elderly or disability status. Now that notice also has to be sent to the tenants if the landlord does not know whether the tenants are claiming elderly or disability status. And by the way, elderly disability status is above the age of 62 disability. There's got to be some sort of verification for your disability. Now, yes, of course, of course.
So if the landlord is planning to keep the property as a rental, they want to not necessarily demolish it, but renovate it so that they can, I don't know, maybe get higher rent because of the upgrades and everything like that. Does this same type of notice still have to go out?
That would be a different notice. That would be a temporary notice to vacate for either some sort of renovation, substantial renovations. It may be a sort of personal one-on-one agreement that they come to with the tenant, but that Topa does not apply to that, okay? Because in those instances, the tenant doesn't get a right to purchase, the tenant just gets a right to return to the unit once the renovations have been made.
But are they obligated, do they have to do a new lease and saying that, hey, once I do these upgrades, you know, like this high-end upgrade of this unit,
sure.
do they have to come back with that same, or do they have to do a new lease?
Okay, so that's a good question. It doesn't apply to Topa, okay? So I just want to stay on track here with our discussions of the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. And the answer to your question is maybe. It depends on the circumstance, okay? All right. Now, if this notice is sent, it has to be sent to the tenants and the Office of the Tenant Advocate. And it can be combined with the solicitation notice, which is the other notice that we just discussed. Now, the owner has to issue, if they send you an offer of sale, they have to send you that offer of sale within 60 days of the status inquiry notice. So this is where things get confusing. The Department of Housing and Community Development, DHCD, they have a rental Accommodations and Conversions Division, RACD, and they have created forms that housing providers automatically use when going through this new process. There are 4 forms, Form 1, Form 2, 3, and 4. Their Form 1 is essentially a mixture of the solicitation notice and the status inquiry notice. They've mixed those two together. And it can cause some confusion for people because the first notice, the solicitation notice, is just an FYI. It's just telling people, the tenants, hey, you know, we're planning on selling the property. You can choose to negotiate or you can choose not to. The second notice, the status inquiry notice, that requires a response. So if you get this notice and you don't respond within 20 days, then you have waived your Topa rights. So it's important to understand that these two notices have sort of been mushed together in a little bit of, well, let's just say I think there's going to be revisions to the form. But what you need to know for the purposes of this presentation is this. If you're a tenant and if you get the Form 1, you have to respond to it within 20 days if you believe you're eligible for receiving Topa rights. And we'll get to the specifics of that. Yes, ma'am.
So you mean collectively or just as an individual?
So,
Respond within 20 days.
yeah, so this is what we're talking about here is Topa as it applies to single-family accommodations. Okay, so is your question if there are multiple people in one lease? Do they?
No. You said that it sent you a note or a letter with, you know, just so that you want to purchase, is that what it is? Or is
Right. Okay, so for those of you who joined, I'll try to just do a quick recap. The new Topa law was changed effective July 3rd. The properties affected are single-family accommodations or single-family accommodations with an accessory dwelling unit, and we went through some examples. And the law says that within 3 calendar days of either receiving a notice or an offer or soliciting the property for sale, that the landlord has to give tenants a notice, and it's sort of an FYI notice. We call it a solicitation notice, just to let the tenants know that the landlord is intending to sell the property. All right. Now, there's also a status inquiry notice, and that's essentially sent to tenants in order to determine whether the tenants are claiming elderly status or status as a person with a disability. All right. So these are the 2 types of notices. They're combined in DHCD's Form 1. So the response to status inquiry notice, right? Or really, it's going to be the response to Form 1 because all the forms that we're getting are almost exclusively that Form 1. You have 20 days from receipt to deliver the response to the owner, and a failure to do so is essentially a waiver of your Topa rights. Now, this applies even if you've already filed for status. As of right now, let's say independently you have requested an exemption as an elderly tenant or as a tenant with a disability, you still have to go through this process until further notice. And the handouts that are in your packets, they give you examples of what sort of documentation you need. So we're not going to go through these in detail, but you do have to send the documentation to the Department of Housing and Community Development on the same day as you send the statement of interest. Yes, sir?
As you go through these, I appreciate it if you differentiate what is different from this and the old Topa.
Sure. You know what? That's a great question. How about this? Why don't I just explain to you what the old Topa law required, and that way we can sort of distinguish between that and this new law as we go along. The reason I didn't originally was because I didn't want to confuse anybody. I didn't want anybody to hear the old stuff and sort of wonder, well, which one is it? I don't know. Previously, Topa applied to everyone. You know, if you lived in a single-family unit, you were entitled to Topa rights, and you were entitled to essentially be able to purchase your unit regardless of your age, your disability status, or anything like that. So let me just say that. Let me leave it at that and say everybody got Topa rights. Now the law has changed, and this is the new law, right? So not everybody gets Topa rights, and the landlord has to send these notices. If you believe that you're eligible for Topa, which is, you have to either be an elderly tenant or a tenant with a disability, then you have to send a notice to your landlord, a response to the landlord saying that, yes, I am claiming the status. Okay? Yes?
Let me see if I understand what the new law says. The new law basically says if it's a single-family accommodation and it's not elderly or disabled, then Topa no longer applies to those people.
Yes.
So what
Yeah.
is a rent control property?
Doesn't matter. Whether or not it's rent control does not matter.
Well, I'm asking because in my building, we have been given the Topa right,
How many units are in your building?
286.
Okay, so this doesn't apply to you. This is for single-family accommodations, for single units. So either a row home or a townhome, a single-family property, or a single condominium units. It does not apply to a 200-some unit property.
Well, we're
Different
gonna-
laws apply.
We're going to be filing the Topa.
Okay. This does not apply to you, ma'am.
Like this change doesn't affect you, you're still in the.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Topa, it distinguishes between single-family properties, properties of 2 to 4 units, and properties of 5 or more units. Okay? So if your property has 2 or more units, the same laws apply that applied before. All right? If your property is a single-family dwelling, then these new laws apply. And the basic gist of it is that the only people eligible for the new law are, and we're about to get to this, a tenant who is elderly or has a disability and has signed a written lease on or before March 31st, 2018, and physically took possession of the unit on or before April 15th, 2018. So all 3 of these conditions have to apply. Either a tenant has to be elderly or have a disability, and must have moved in prior to March 31, and, signed a lease prior to March 31, and must have moved in prior to April 15th, 2018. All right? So if all 3 of those conditions apply, Topa applies to you, and you're entitled to receive an offer of sale. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, did we establish what is the age for elderly?
62 years age or older. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. And the documentation for that is just, birth certificate, driver's license, ID, government issued, or any other documentation that's satisfactory to the rent administrator. Okay? All right. So if you're eligible, you are entitled to receive an offer of sale. All right? So let's say the process goes as intended. Landlord sends out a Form 1. You receive it, and let's say you either have a disability and it's documented, or you're, say, 65 years of age. You then have 20 days to respond and say, hey, I'm claiming status as a tenant with a disability or an elderly tenant. Then, and that's Form 2, by the way, all right? Form 2 is the response to Form 1. All right. Then the landlord sends you an offer of sale. All right? Now, this offer of sale has to be sent to all tenants who claim and are eligible for Topa status. So again, you moved in before April 15th, you signed your lease agreement before March 31, and you're elderly or you have a disability. And by the way, we've had this question a lot, which is, well, I've been living in the unit for a long time. I am an elderly tenant, but I don't have a lease agreement. This law will not, unfortunately, give you Topa rights. You have to have a lease agreement. Did you have your hand up back here? No? Okay. So 20 days from receiving the offer of sale, if you're eligible for Topa, you have to respond with a statement of interest. And a statement of interest essentially is any document that you sent to the landlord saying, hey, I'm interested in exercising my Topa rights. And there's a specific form included with the offer of sale. It's Form 4. So offer of sale is Form 3, and the response to the offer of sale is Form 4. So you've got Forms 1 and 2, which is the initial the notice and the response to the notice, and you've got Forms 3 and 4, which is the offer of sale and the response to the offer of sale. Once the landlord receives the offer of sale, that starts a negotiation period. That negotiation period lasts 25 days. The negotiation period is a time period during which the tenant and the landlord can agree on a contract. Now, if the landlord has, let's say the landlord decides, I want $500,000 for this property. And you as the tenant believe, okay, it's worth $500,000, I'm going to make that offer. Great. You sign a contract and you go forward with the purchase. But let's say you believe the property is only worth, I don't know, $450,000. Now you can make an offer to the landlord. You could say, look, I don't think it's worth that much. I'm going to offer you $400,000. And the landlord may say, no, I want $470,000, and you go back and forth. That's what this 25-day negotiation period is for. You have to have a signed contract by the end of this 25-day negotiation period in order for you to proceed to the next step, which is the settlement period or financing period. And basically that just means you have 45 days once you have a signed contract to obtain financing. That 45 days can be extended up to 75 days if your lender sends a letter saying that we need additional time to provide this financing. Yes, ma'am. Yes, yes, yes. The landlord is eligible to take other offers, but if the landlord enters into an agreement with somebody else, and we'll get to this, but you would be able to match that. And we'll talk about that later, okay? All right, assignment. So previously, there were no restrictions on what you could do in terms of assigning your Topa rights, right? You could sell it to somebody, you could give it away, you could exchange your rights in exchange for something else. Like you could say to somebody, look, I'm going to give you my Topa rights, you come in and you redevelop this property, or you remodel my unit, or whatever it is. That law has changed as it relates to single-family accommodations. Here's the only thing that you can do with regard to assigning your rights. You can get a 12-month extension on your lease for the same rate. Essentially, it's a rent freeze. It's a 1-year renewal of your lease at the same rate. That's all. You're not allowed to get a financial compensation. You're not allowed to get any other compensation. And you're only allowed to reassign your Topa rights once. So let me just clarify that. Let's say that Mr. Adams decides that he's going to assign his rights to Mr. Hershey, right? Now, Mr. Hershey is a developer. And he says, I'm going to commit, I'm going to buy the property, I'm going to do X, Y, Z with it. Fine. Let's say Mr. Hershey decides that he wants to reassign the property. He cannot reassign the property to Ms. Morris. Not allowed to do that. He can reassign the property without consideration. In other words, he can't get any money for it. Only to a private or nonprofit corporation or partnership of which he himself is an owner, officer, or managing member. Okay? So essentially, it's just, let's say you gave somebody your rights and then they want to sort of own the property in the name of a company. That's how they would be able to do it. But you can't just keep reassigning like you were able to do before. All right. A couple other provisions. Topa offers prior to July 3rd, 2018? We get a lot of this question that, hey, wait a second, I got an offer. I live in a single-family accommodation. I initially got my offer prior to July 3rd. What happens? Well, if you received an offer of sale prior to July 3rd, your TOPA rights have begun to vest. So the landlord has to go through that process until, and either sell the property to you or has to wait out there's a 180-day start-over period. Has to wait out that 180-day period, and then after that, they can issue no TOPA rights. But they cannot, there's no grandfathering in of TOPA offers that were sent before July 3rd. If the offer was sent after July 3rd, then it's fine. Then the new TOPA laws apply. Does that make sense?
Almost.
Okay, go ahead.
So if a tenant had assigned his or her rights prior to July 3rd, 2018,
Uh-huh.
then the assignee of those TOPA rights would still, the landlord would have to honor that assignment with the old law until the lapse period.
Yes. Did the tenant receive an offer of sale prior to signing his or her rights? Yes. If the offer of sale was given prior to July 3rd, then the tenant rights, TOPA rights have vested. Sometimes people, do assignment of their rights ahead of time in anticipation. Those would not apply. Okay? All right. Sure. 15-day right of first refusal. This goes back to a question that you asked before, which is, can the landlord accept other offers? In addition to everything that I've explained to you, if you do have TOPA rights, so if you're eligible, you're elderly, tenant with a disability, moved in before April 15th, signed a lease before March 31st, you still have the 15-day right of first refusal. So even if all of the, let's say you don't respond in the right amount of time and your time runs out, you can still match any third-party offers. So in our example of the $500,000 offer, let's say you don't want it at $500,000 and you can't really come to an agreement in the negotiation period. If the landlord then later on says, you know what, I'm going to sell it, here's a contract for $480 that I just signed with Corey, you can say, oh no, wait a second, I do want it at $480. All right? You have 15 days to respond to that. Yes, ma'am.
I'm confused because,
Sure.
for example, in my building, we're filing to prevent the sale of the property. I've
So-
approved collectively.
Ma'am, can I ask you to, that's a specific question about your building, which is more than one unit. Can I ask you to come ask me that question after the class? And I'm happy to answer it for you.
Yes, I did get a letter, so I'm just like, okay.
Sure, I understand. Okay. Other tenant protections under the Rental Housing Act. This is really important, guys. Just because you're not eligible to receive TOPA rights doesn't mean you lose any other rights. So what does that mean? That means that even, let's say, you're not elderly or you don't have a disability or for any other reason, TOPA, the new TOPA laws do not apply to you, and your building gets sold, you still have all of the other tenant protections that you had before. You don't have to leave just because your building has been sold. And the landlord can't violate any of your laws, any of your rights, just because the building is being sold. And that's really important to understand. If you've got any questions about that, please ask and let's talk about it. All right, let's do a quick case study before we wrap up. Luther Landans is renting a single-family home in Berry Farms to Ricky Renner. The property includes a detached carriage house in the backyard that is being rented separately to Ms. Othert Anant, Mr. Othert Anant, and his mother-in-law. What are Luther's obligations under TOPA if he wants to sell the property? Okay, so you've got this landlord. The first question we've got to ask is this a single-family accommodation? We have a single-family home with a detached carriage house in the backyard. Please raise your hand if you believe this falls under the category of single-family accommodation. Okay, please raise your hand if you believe it does not fall. Why do you believe it does not fall within the category?
Because he's renting
Okay. So, that's actually not the case. I know. Initially, I thought the same thing you did, and that's why I'm raising this example. Even though you're renting it out to separate tenants, this particular example, when you have a detached carriage house separately, that's an accessory dwelling unit, right? And so a single family accommodation plus an accessory dwelling unit still falls under this new law.
So it's slightly different than that row home.
Exactly. Because that would not be considered an accessory dwelling unit. Okay? Sure. Now, it falls under the Topa rights. So what does Luther have to do? What notices does Luther have to send to which tenants? Anybody? I'm sorry? Okay. So, what notice do they get? Right of first refusal? Well, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Look, the landlord can send the right of well, first of all, we haven't even gotten to a contract yet, right? Luther doesn't have a contract yet, right? He wants to sell the property, right? So the right of first refusal comes into play when a landlord has entered into a contract with a third party, and then the tenant gets to match that contract. We're not there yet. I'm sorry? Form 1, that's right. So Luther has to send a Form 1. Who does Luther have to send a Form 1 to? The mother-in-law? Why the mother-in-law? We don't know, right? Okay. Okay, so the notice has to be sent to everyone, right? Remember that solicitation notice has to be sent to everyone, whether or not they are eligible for Topa. Okay? Now, because those two forms are combined, in effect, everybody does get the same notice here, but the law does separate those two. We're just not going to worry about that. We're going to say he has to send Form 1. Now, you brought up the question of whether his mother-in-law is elderly. Yes, if she is elderly, and what other requirements would have to apply for her to be eligible for Topa? She has to have a written lease, signed when? Before March 31st. And she must have moved in when? Before April 15th. Okay. If all of those apply, then they're eligible for Topa. All right? Now, even if Ricky himself is not eligible for Topa, they might be. Now, a question that comes up here is, well, what happens if they're both eligible? Let's say they're both elderly or they both have a disability. In that scenario, it's treated like a two-unit property in the sense that both of them, they can choose to buy the property together, or they can each separately submit an offer. Okay? But they all have Topa rights if they're eligible according to these laws. Okay? And once they get the offer of sale, they submit a statement of interest. The landlord, if they both submit a statement of interest, the landlord gets to choose. If they're both the identical amount, the landlord just has to come up with some differentiating factor to pick one. And if there isn't one, the landlord just gets to pick one. All right? And that's it. Yes, ma'am.
You said that they have, so all three of the conditions have to be met.
Yes, ma'am.
One of the conditions is not applying. Somebody doesn't have to say.
Okay, so either being an elderly tenant or having a disability, that's one condition, right? So one condition is that. A second condition is having a signed lease before March 31st. And a third condition is having moved in before April 15th. Okay? So if the tenant is either not elderly or doesn't have a disability, the tenant doesn't qualify. Okay? And that just means you get to stay there. You know, the property changes ownership. Now the new owner becomes your landlord, but you don't have any Topa rights. And you can try to bid and purchase the property just like anybody else. You just don't get special Topa rights that other tenants might. Okay? Now, any questions? Anything that, you know, look, I know that this law is not very clear, or I know, it took us, I don't know, a couple months just for our office to really understand all the nuance. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. Yes?
So the right of first refusal would be helpful to make sure I'm clarifying that.
Sure.
So regardless of whether a person falls under that Topa exception
Yes.
or disability or senior, at the end of the day, so long as they can provide it, which they have to be provided with an offer of sale from the landlord, right? Do you have to have responded with Form 2 to say, I do have, and is Form 2 just the response to say that I identify myself as?
You're claiming, Form 2 is you claiming elderly or disability status.
Okay. So if I am not able to claim an elderly or disabled status, do I still have any sort of right of first refusal?
No.
Okay, so only disabled or
Yes.
elderly. Okay.
Right of first refusal is essentially a second bite at the apple, right? So the first bite of the apple is the initial offer of sale that the tenants who are eligible for this or for 2 or more units get. The second bite at the apple is if for some reason, you know, the first time go around in the process, you either didn't purchase, couldn't come up with the money, or you couldn't agree on a purchase price, for whatever reason, you still get that second bite at the apple, and it's only 15 days just to make sure that, you know, you have all the rights that are afforded to you.
Can I come see it now?
Yes. Well,
Okay.
hold on. Are there any other questions?
I do,
Yes, ma'am.
If the two people were saying that,
Yes.
what if they both come, okay, we have two different bids, we want
If they have 2 different bids, then the landlord just can choose one of those bids,
usually a little bit, right?
the highest.
I mean,
Unless the landlord's super silly. Yeah. Usually the highest bid. But, you know, I mean, there might be circumstances where the landlord might choose a slightly lower bid if it's a better offer. Let's say it's a cash offer, for example, or no contingencies, or no, no delays, that sort of thing. But usually they'll take the higher. Yes?
have there been any changes to, here's an emergency?
Uh-huh. There have been no changes to Topa laws regarding 2 to 4 units or 5 or more units. The only changes are for single-family accommodations. Yes, sir?
The various time limits you called out for this new Topa,
Yes.
are they the same as the old Topa?
No.
Or a multifunctional?
No, they're different. Yeah, you've got 20 days from when you get Form 1 to respond to Form 1. Now, if at the same time, look, under this new law, the landlord can really speed up the process. They can just say, you know what, forget about Form 1. We're going to send Form 1 and Form 3 together, right? We're just going to assume, you know, you're eligible, and we're going to send Form 1 and Form 3, and we're going to say, if here's your offer of sale. You know, we don't need to wait an additional 20 days. If you're eligible, here's your offer of sale. You can respond, and if you're elderly or if you have a tenant with a disability, then, you know, you get your Topa rights. So it's that 20 days initially, plus a 25-day negotiation period, plus a 45 to 75-day settlement or financing period. So those time frames are different. And I don't want to say the previous time frames because I don't want those numbers to be in anybody's mind and anybody to be confused.
I'm the president of a tenant association in a big building, and I'm just interested to see if anything changed for my Topa.
Okay.
I'm saying nothing.
I wish you would have asked me that at the beginning. I could have saved you a lot of time. But no, nothing has changed when it comes to your building. Yeah. All right. So if there are no further questions with regard to this presentation, then I'm happy to meet with you. And
It's actually not as complicated, it's just kind of a technicality. Okay.
hold on.
Thank you, Mayor.
Of course. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance. And maybe
Letter of what?
I got a letter from
Yeah, offer of sale.
So I'm confused.